At the same time, the other fellows began to say that it was a share of the big catch. And even if they split the amount, it would be $1 million each. But suddenly I heard Jin Woo ask me to give him my contract that I had signed earlier. He wanted to examine it thoroughly, and when he did, he turned to us all and said he had an urgent question. He showed my contract to the leader and started saying that it doesn't say anything about sharing magic crystals except those that fell out of monsters. That means we have to divide the mana crystals among the 10, not the 12. But the leader turned with his strange smile and said that of course we will divide everything equally, that he already knows perfectly well. But there was one thing that had to be dealt with first. It was a huge spider that was sitting right above us. The guys from that raid realized it was a dungeon boss that was sitting right above us and looking at us with his big red eyes. The leader started saying that everyone should understand that if the boss is defeated, the gate will close. Therefore, we must retrieve and transfer the mana crystals before we can defeat the spider. Luckily, it looks like he's asleep after stuffing his stomach, and this is the perfect chance to transfer the crystals. But first we have to bring the equipment. To this the other guy replied that who would have guessed we'd find crystals in a C-rank dungeon, and he left the miner's equipment in the car. But the leader started saying he was an idiot and telling him to make a habit of carrying it with him. They apologized to us and asked Jin and me to watch the place for the two of us, and they had to go and get our gear. Jin Woo was agitated, for he had heard everything right, that we should be left alone with the boss. But the leader began to say that he didn't think he would attack us, unless, of course, we invaded his territory ourselves. He seems to have had enough and is now napping, and everything will be fine as long as we don't provoke him. We have to trust the leader and keep our voices down, because something might happen if we keep talking loudly. The leader says he has something to tell the others, so they go and have a smoke and come back soon. I watched them leave and realized that according to the rules there had to be at least 10 people in the squad, not counting me and Jin Woo, and there were 8 in our squad. And that means that they repeatedly did so. Since they went into the gate that way, surely there would have been no need to fill the 2 empty spaces here. As soon as the leader and his group withdrew, he ordered that the entrance to the boss's room be blocked. And as soon as we heard the loud sound, we realized that everything had been stoned. And then it finally dawned on me that you guys are revealed to be lizards. I remembered being told that sometimes there are bastards like lizards, and incidents inside the dungeon are rare, because it's a pretty dangerous job. And even if a crime has occurred, it's hard to investigate. That's why this is often the place they use. There are no cameras that can be viewed from the outside. So who's going to stop the hunters? No one. Fix the text for mistakes, and the weaker you are, the quicker you just get rid of you. But if you are strong, people will reach out to you. If they say you're useless or in the way, they'll get rid of you like a lizard shedding its tail. That's why I was told to be careful. After all, I was the weakest hunter in the world. At this time I began to panic and didn't know what to do. After all, the entrance was backed up. He was upset that these bastards were trying to kill us, and they wanted to kill us. At this time, I realized that I wouldn't have been able to stop them anyway, because we had already fallen into the trap they had set. If we did anything, they were already ready to kill us. I remembered the leader telling me that it was all clear because of me, but it would have been all right if I hadn't paid attention to the little things. Now I knew what he meant. I threw my backpack on the ground and remembered that the guy who was the light mage's name was Guwon. He'd done a good job, and getting out of here wasn't that difficult. But the real problem was that this explosion had awakened the dungeon boss with rank. At this time, the group that had abandoned us started coming out of the dungeon. They said that since they had memorized the way out of here, it would be easy to get back after the break. Another guy started saying that we should just kill them there and everything would be a lot easier. But the leader started saying that if we put up a fight and wake up the spider boss, how could we get the mana crystals? The weakest E-ranked hunter and the D-ranked hunter, who has no experience, have no chance to deal with the boss. Despite their best efforts, after the boss spider eats them and goes to sleep, we can take advantage of this and get the mana crystals. If this works, we have to kill the boss. And then there's the whole Jin Woo outfit. It looks like we can get 1,000,001 with the sword and shield alone, but if we can't get all the mana crystals, we can still get his stuff in the end. The leader decided to find out what kind of rich family he came from, because at least we need to arrange a funeral for him, since the Rastasina caused a big ruckus. The boss is now furious, and none of this group has the courage to fight this monster alone, for it is impossible. Not even the leader would dare do it. Despite their best efforts, the 2 hunters will not be able to survive anytime soon. We stood and watched as the big boss spider approached us. Jinho ordered me to stay behind, and he would figure something out. Jinho looked at this monster and began to say that he had many eyes, a hideous mouth and huge size, long legs. His power is on a completely different level. Jinho didn't know where I was before and that I had met a horrible monster a month ago. The thought of him terrifies me. I said it was nonsense and started walking towards this boss. My dagger already appeared in my hand. I said that this monster was mine and I would destroy it myself, but he didn't understand what I was trying to do. I replied that of course I would finish him off. He thought I was crazy. After all, he knew it was impossible to defeat a boss on your own, unless you were an elite or higher in the city. He didn't understand how I could beat him, but I told him to think harder about getting out of here. In a way he was right. Even after waking up I was still weak, but I wondered why I didn't feel much pressure to bring me to my knees. The Azure Basilisk Swamp Lord I had met in that dungeon was too strong for an E-rank boss, perhaps he was even taller. The boss golem was rank D or lower, and compared to them this boss was incredibly strong. Perhaps this means that I became serious enough not to tremble in fear of a boss of my rank. My failing level was 18, and I was able to defeat this boss. This giant spider rushed right at me, but I jumped up and hit it with my blade. As a result, the monster started screaming, and I realized that my attacks were successful. My Rasaki Fawn turned out to be a pretty good weapon, and that explains why hunters are called hunters because of their desire to kill. Now the real hunting was just beginning. I started running straight ahead. He looked at me with his mouth open and didn't understand what I was doing. He watched me fight and realized that this was the E-rank hunter. I kept fighting this horrible monster, but it was easier for me to dodge all his attacks and block his big tentacle blows with my speed. I was able to hit him on his big legs, even though his shell was very strong. I needed to plunge the dagger as deep as possible to damage it. After a couple of minutes of fighting, I realized that it had no blind spots. The spider has 8 legs and can easily penetrate the floor or rocks. Every attack can be deadly. It takes time to get close to him. I kept attacking with all my might. Jinho looked at all this and did not understand who I was, an E-rank hunter. But for him it was impossible to believe, because the guild said that I was definitely an E-rank. However, my movements did not seem so, and he probably realized that I was a false rank. After all, there are those among the hunters who can control their level of magical power. If they wanted to, they could lower their rank. Hunters who hide their true power are called pseudo-rangers. And the problem is that pseudo-rans are mostly psychopaths who kill for their own pleasure. Jinho looked at me, a look full of rage. I looked even more horrible than the monster himself. In that moment, fear possessed him, and he didn't know why he said he was coming here. After all, he should have listened to his father when he said it wasn't for me. I fought the monster, and I wondered how long it took. Maybe 5 or 10 minutes? Because of that, my stamina was slowly running out. I didn't even have time to hit him. The problem was that as my fatigue increased, my speed dropped, and I couldn't prolong the battle any longer. The only chance I had of winning was in the special ability of my dagger. I decided to use it against him. After all, I had the paralysis effect, the bleeding effect, and the weak spot on my head, the eyes, which are the weakest part of the head in all living creatures. However, I didn't expect this spider to spit its horrible acid. When I saw the acid burn a hole near my feet, I realized that this spider was hiding a trump card up its sleeve and I was running out of time. If this continues, I need to shorten the distance faster and right now. I used my active jerk skill and got to this monster in the blink of an eye, instantly shortening the distance. At this point, I activated the paralysis effect, as I wanted to get it over with as soon as possible, but I couldn't deliver a critical hit. I needed to accelerate even faster. I was a little short. Jinho watched me and saw how fast I was, but she knew that my stamina would run out if I kept this up. I kept approaching this spider and was already close to it, but my fatigue was only 70%. At one point the spider hit me with its big foot, but it flew off, leaving a hole in the ground. I saw that the spider was about to strike one last time, and I remembered that I had a status recovery effect. I was able to apply it before that big paw reached me. At this point I was already over the spider and was able to thrust my dagger right into its eye. I took the dagger out and struck a few more blows. My paralysis effect was also activated, and the spider began to bleed. At this time my opponent was losing 1% of his health every second. I kept throwing more and more punches and finally delivered one last crushing blow. The system informed me that the dungeon boss had been defeated. At that point, my level went up and I was excited to get my daily quest reward. And if I didn't know what might have happened. Jin Woo stood at the side and watched the whole thing. He couldn't believe his eyes that I had single-handedly defeated the boss. He looked at me and realized that I was definitely a liar. He saw me with a horrified grin as I began to slice through just a spider to finish off my magic crystals. At that moment, Jin Woo turned to me and offered to put my magic crystals, which he was holding, in his backpack. At which point he held out his hand to me and said that I must be thirsty and should take this water. I didn't understand what was happening to him. For in an instant he picked up a pickaxe and started chiseling mana crystals. And then I realized that I was something of a savior to him. But at that moment the passageway, which had been blocked, collapsed, and I saw the guys who had abandoned us approaching us. Those guys walked in on us, and they had a leader at the head who looked at us and couldn't believe his eyes that we were all still alive. The boss was dead, and they didn't understand what had happened. They didn't believe that we could overpower him ourselves. But they probably thought that Spider was just dumb and big, and they didn't pay attention to Jin Woo, who was able to rattle the boss. After all, that explains their victory. The leader underestimated us, and if he had known the special properties of his equipment, he might have helped. He must have killed him himself. He had no idea what special properties his equipment had. After all, becoming his enemy was too risky. At this point, the leader decided to poach Jin Woo to himself and said that he looked him up on the internet. After all, his outfit is too conspicuous. It turned out that he was the son of an important big shot, the famous chairman of the Eugene Construction Company. It was definitely his father, but Jin Woo replied, "So what?" The leader said that he certainly assumed he was from a wealthy family, but for it to really turn out to be true, he wanted to talk about what today they will give Jin Woo a chance if he kills son Jin Woo. He should kill him and join them. It's the only way to survive, or they'll both end up dead. The leader didn't understand why Jin Woo was slow. After all, no one will know about this anyway, since we are still in the dungeon. Jin Woo turned around to look me in the eye, but I told him it was okay, because it was. No wonder he betrays me, for I am weak. But suddenly Jin Woo took my side and decided to fight alongside me, and now those guys were deciding what to do. But the leader said it was stupid to kill a rich man's son, and we had to deal with the weak man first. As soon as they began to approach us, I saw that I had been given an emergency quest, and there would be a penalty for not completing the quest. I needed to kill 8 enemies. I didn't understand what it was, because the system suddenly gave me the instructions for the quest. I saw that it said that there were subjects nearby who intended to kill the player. I need to destroy them and ensure my safety. If the quest fails, my heart stops and I need to kill 8 enemies. But at that moment there was an explosion, and I flew far back and crashed into a nearby wall. At this time I didn't realize what had happened, and as soon as he turned around, he saw me. I was lying on my chest on the rocks. At this time, I didn't understand why it was me. I had forgotten that this place focuses on survival of the fittest. Nowhere else, and so far my thinking has been wrong. Have entered the dungeon many times and even overcame my limits, increased and entered the dungeon again. Always thought this place was safe, but enemies in the system force me to kill, and I have to kill them all if I don't want to be killed. It would be ridiculous if I were to die now, and it's not an accident or ill will, it's what the system needs. I saw that the system wants me to be strong. It was obvious to me. I realized that the system was using me, but I was going to use the system. The guy who hit me, they started joking around and saying that his skills had deteriorated, because after that hit he should have been dead already. But the leader told him to take it more seriously. The guy who hit me started saying that he had definitely put all his strength into that magic attack, because he had put in quite a lot of mana. But how could it have turned out like that? He missed. But at this point I was completely serious and started telling them that they were playing with people's lives and now they were going to have to face the consequences. But these guys didn't understand what I was telling them, but I was getting closer and closer, and I said that since they were hunters, they should be prepared to be targets themselves. And the first one standing said he would deal with me. As he approached me, he put his hand on my shoulder and said that I didn't seem to understand my situation very well. But before he could say another word, my blade was already at his throat, and I slashed it with one motion of my hand. A second later I dropped him to the ground, and everyone standing next to me was in shock. But I was serious and said that I was the first one ready, and now I only had 7 enemies to kill. The leader looked at me and didn't understand when I had time to pull out my dagger. The leader looked at me and realized that it didn't matter how unprepared I was, but his was a Dirang hunter. I was out of my mind, because it got to the point where I killed a man, and I could make all the excuses I wanted, that the system made me, but that wouldn't change the fact that I killed someone. After all, I must kill or be killed, and I can no longer run away from it all. If only the strongest are destined to survive, then I will only become strong so that what happened a month ago when I was studying in that double dungeon and where those horrible things happened that give me the creeps. It was when I first saw good hunters and good people die in horrible ways. We tried to survive, but in the end most were killed. I will never forget what happened to me, the way I was abandoned and ran away leaving me alone. I have seen strong hunters cry. Well, of course, in the end everyone left me. And I was left alone, wounded and exhausted, and I thought I could trust these men, but they abandoned me. Even though I was too good to them and helped them as much as I could. I am a different person now, not the same as I used to be. My eyes burn differently, and I look different. I have become more violent, and now no one can overpower me. After all, I didn't just come all this way to get here. I was too serious at this point, and there was a terrifying aura coming from me. But those guys in front of me weren't about to let their guard down and decided to take another wrong punch that sent me flying off into the wall. That mage started to attack me, but I ran aside and approached him in a flash, saying that his magic only annoyed me. I was able to cut through my second enemy, and everyone who was looking at me from those bastards began to run at me with the goal of finishing me off. As soon as they got close to me, I was able to kill my third enemy by cutting off his arm and stabbing him with my dagger. As he fell to the ground, the others were terrified, for they did not understand how I could move like that, and they could not manage to hit me. I was too fast for them, but I knew that sometimes hunters can be game for a tougher hunter. Now it was their time, and at one point I activated my paralysis skill, and the body of one of the attackers was unable to move. They thought it was some kind of magic, but I was too strong. Jin Woo, who was watching me, saw that I was a little stronger now than when I fought the dungeon boss. And the moment my bleeding paralysis hit my enemies, those guys were in terrible pain and didn't understand where I was coming from. But it was too late, and they all fell to the ground. Here was the last one left, and it was the leader of this gang. He couldn't believe it, because he saw it. For a moment I could make out his whole crew. He realized that I was hiding my powers and that I was the one who killed this dungeon boss. He didn't expect all his men to be defeated, so he decided to show me that not all rangers are the same. The leader used reinforcement and started flying straight at me, saying that it didn't matter what kind of monster I was. And after a fight with a boss and 7 hunters, I would be exhausted, because there was no way a tired hunter could penetrate his armor with some knife. And a hunter with an emphasis on speed and dexterity shouldn't have an ability that will pierce his reinforcement ability, and he'll die the moment he touches it. But the leader, the Don bitch, was strong, but something he didn't notice was the way I was already near him. I grabbed his head and slammed him to the ground. He didn't know that I kept raising my level. He was lying on the ground, covered in a pile of rocks, and he didn't understand what was happening. In the blink of an eye, I stomped his face into the ground. When he raised his head, he saw me standing over him with my blade in my hands and began to beg me to spare him. He promised to give me money and to give me all the mana crystals and magic stones. I didn't understand why he was asking for mercy from the man who had tried to kill him 3 times, but the leader didn't think I would get away with it. I ordered him to be quiet, for no one would know what had happened in that dungeon. At this point the leader started screaming that I had no idea who his little brother was. Before he could even say his last word, I cut off his head and he fell to the ground. I stood there and saw that all my clothes were torn again. Also, they were getting a little small in size. I decided it was time for me to go to the store and buy myself something new. But when I got back, I saw that Jin Woo had gotten sick from what he'd seen. At that moment I realized that the boss of this dungeon had been defeated, and we needed to leave this place as soon as possible. 12-1-2. But at this time in Washington, USA, someone had a beautiful morning, and the guy who woke up wondering what time it was in Korea because he had a bad dream and even his eyes were moist as if he was crying in his sleep. A little later in one of the buildings, a man came up to Jin Chul's manager and said that something had happened here. He began to explain that 8 people had died in the course of the dungeon, but the survivors were 2 hunters, D and E, both of rank. The manager reported and saw that it said they had just escaped, and that was quite normal. But the other guy said they didn't run away, they cleared the dungeon. He began to explain that the D-rank hunter Jin Woo was an incredibly high-ranked hunter and had a different outfit. Perhaps this allowed him to defeat the boss. The boss turned out to be the giant arachnid Bermuda. He was not dangerous to organized groups, and it was strange that 8 people died. But the manager told him not to beat around the bush and said, if there wasn't anything unusual, you wouldn't be talking to me right now and decide for yourself. But the other man said that the other survivor was Hunter Song Jin Woo, from that very incident, and that seemed a little suspicious to the manager. She decided that they had nothing to worry about, because the magic power meter they were using at the time was a high-end item extracted from A-rank monsters, and overwaking is such a common occurrence, and they didn't need to become paranoid. One check is enough. But that guy also wanted to think it was just a coincidence, but he couldn't let it go so easily, because one of the dead was Hunter Dong Suk. The manager was talking about Hunter Huang Dong Su's older brother. In that case, he can't leave it that way, but I was at home in my apartment at the time and was sitting with my sister. My sister began to ask, why did I buy chicken wings? Unless something was wrong, but I told her that I hadn't figured out yet, good or bad. But my sister guessed something was wrong. After all, I'm usually such a cheapskate, but I was worried about another problem. I wanted to get drunk, no matter how much I drank, I didn't feel anything. But suddenly the notification system showed me that noxious substances had been detected, and my passive ability to be immune to poisons would cancel out the negative effects. And I realized that because of the ability issued to me by the system, it was now not even affecting me. And 3 seconds later, the negative effect was successfully cancelled. I remembered how I had received the reward the system had given me after I had passed that horrible dungeon. And how many things had happened lately that I just overlooked. And to think, I had been rewarded with something like that. Also, thanks to this reward for the mission, the leg I lost was restored. Suddenly it occurred to me that if I was no longer susceptible to all poisons, I decided to check it out. I got up and started walking away. My sister asked me if I wouldn't eat it, she could do it for me. I told her she could get as fat as she wanted, and my sister looked at me. It was hard for her to get used to me after I started my workouts. After all, I used to be so nonchalant. But she seems to be looking at me more seriously now. Sister realized that it was because something happened in the dungeon. When I went into my room, I decided to see if all the negative effects were automatically cancelled. Could my ability handle the negative effects of this item? But it didn't matter, so I decided to just check. And after 3 seconds, the negative effects were successfully cancelled. The effect of the object's poison dewlap and its muscle weakness were cancelled, and everything happened just as I thought it would. But suddenly my sister came into my room and asked me if I knew anyone named Jiho, as he was calling me on the phone. A little later I went into the cafe where I met the guy. When I went up to him, I asked him how he found my number, but he said it was all thanks to the guild. He had connections there. Soon after, he offered me a cup of coffee, but I declined. I was surprised to see him again, but he said I was his savior. I smiled, for he had shared magic stones with me, and I was able to earn some money. If anything, I was able to make almost $900 in taxes. And the fact that he kept his mouth shut didn't cause me any problems. But Jinho responded that the guys tried to kill us first, and that we were hunters, so we couldn't give up our lives so easily. And it was an internal showdown. Jinho sat there nervous, because he understood that I was hiding my rank and that I was a homicidal maniac. There was no way he would normally deal with someone like that. Eventually, I asked him, why did he call me? But afterwards Jinho told me that he was actually planning to start his own fighting guild. But I immediately said that I refuse and don't even want to listen to him if he hasn't already finished talking. After all, if he is forming a battle group and wants me to join, I still wondered what it would be. But I'm not going to babysit rich kids. If he doesn't have anything to add, I'll just leave. But Jinho got up and started saying that all I had to do was help him 19 times. After that I asked him if he wanted me to go to the dungeon with him 19 times. But he replied that he promised to split the loot fairly. I started to tell him that he should have realized by now that hunters not only happen to kill monsters, but people as well. Raiding is not an extreme sport, and even so, he still wants to assemble a battle group, and he won't change his mind, even after the horrors he's seen. I asked Jinho if he might want to be the head of the guild. Shortly thereafter, he replied that he did, and I should hear him out. After all, like I said, he wants a guild head license. For a hunter, it's not that hard to get. You can get a guild leader's license after you've been to at least 20 raids, and he's already been to one. There are 19 more to visit, and of course there is still an exam, but if he's going to be company, he's sure of himself here. I asked him what he thought of it, because he was the second son of Eugene Company, and rightly so. Jin Woo began to say that his becoming head of the guild was directly related to his company, and his father wanted to start a guild. And then I realized that although the dungeons are dangerous, on the other hand, there are simply mountains of treasure hidden in them, magic stones and monocrystals being only a small part. Even the corpses of monsters are useful for materials. There is nothing useless in dungeons. Of course, the business sharks are interested in all this, and the hunters sit on the company's payroll, surrendering everything found in the dungeons to them. In this way, they come out self-sufficient. Jin Woo began to say that his father planned to hire an S-rank hunter and make him head of the guild, and his brother would be the deputy, running the guild under the guise of assisting. However, I replied to Jin Woo that if my memory serves me correctly, there are only 9 S-rank hunters in our country. If my father plans to hire a hunter who is not registered with the guilds, the only option left is a min one, but he is retired now. And even if his brother becomes deputy head, the difference in authority is too great, and a division between the two factions will be inevitable. However, Jin Woo replied that his brother is gifted but not awakened, and he is not strong enough for the title of head. Given his age and low rank, he certainly won't get anywhere. I understood that he was planning to gain experience and respect so he could appeal to his father. I replied that this was the case, because if I continued to hide my capabilities, wouldn't I need like-minded people? After all, compared to going to dungeons with a high-ranking hunter, and the accomplishments of clearing dungeons with someone E-rank is much higher. But I answered him all he said, what I would get out of it. When Jin Woo handed me a folder with everything written on it, and I read it, I was very much surprised by what it said. I certainly didn't expect this. The next day, I asked my sister why she decided to come to practice with me. After all, it was hard to get her out of the house before. My sister started asking that she thought things were getting better for me lately, and anyway, it was better than sitting around doing nothing. I told her to keep up with me during this run, and while we were running, I decided to ask my sister, assuming she unexpectedly got 3 million won, what she would do with it. She didn't understand why I was asking that, and then she said she could buy a bigger house with it. And for the rest she never even thought about it. 3. My sister started asking me if it was too fantastic an amount and why exactly 3 billion won. But to me, that amount wasn't that fantastic. At this point, I started to run even faster, and my sister stayed behind me. She stopped and didn't understand why I started running so fast. But 3 billion was the amount Jin Woo offered me. After all, it's an assignment we're working on, and we plan to use it as a guild office. The estimated cost of this project is 3 billion won, but the price will go up. The $3 million building was bought by me for 19 trips to the dungeons. Heard from Jin Woo that it was a small price to pay for the opportunity to become the head of a guild, and it turned out to be just that. I started to wonder about it, because I didn't realize what I had to do for 3 billion. Normally, I wouldn't have turned down such a sum for anything, but we mustn't forget that I am a unique case, even among the awakened, and no one has ever heard of a hunter increasing his level and becoming stronger. And if that happens, the 3 billion is nothing. But I had my own conditions, which Jin Woo had to accept. I said it was just the two of us, and no one else at that moment. Jin Woo got nervous, because if he's not wrong, I want us to clean up the dungeon alone. From the rank, everything was right. I told him that he got it right, but Jin Woo replied to me that only a group of 10 people could enter the dungeon. I told him that people would line up for the chance to get money just by being a crowd, and we'd use Huang Dongsu's method. Jin Woo started to get nervous. It was dangerous for him to drink. But I realized that he couldn't handle 2-2. In other words, if we can handle it, no one gets hurt. He just needs to think about it. After all, let's say we successfully completed 19 raids as part of our group. We'll be the group that successfully completed 19 raids. And wouldn't that look impressive in his father's eyes? And now, finally, Jin Woo understands, and that's what we're going to do from now on. But Jin Woo will have to recruit more men immediately. As I ran, I remembered this conversation with Jin Woo. But suddenly I realized that I had completed my daily task, and it was complete. I stopped and realized that I had gone a little overboard. After all, I had run 11 kilometers instead of 10. When I had already turned around, I thought my sister was running behind me, But she wasn't there. I started thinking about why the quest was counting even after I had completed the quest, and I decided that I needed to wait for my sister anyway. So why don't I still do the workout? And after 20 minutes, I exceeded all of my daily tasks and realized that after 200 times I could no longer do squats, push-ups, and abs. And it's the same with running. I realized I can't run 200k. So I'll start with 20 for now, but suddenly my sister was behind me. She was so tired when she got to me. As soon as she stopped to talk to me, I started running even harder at this point and ended up running farther and farther away from her. At this time in Washington, D.C., a man was on the phone to be sent information on these two survivors. And at this point the girl came into the room and asked Mr. Huang what he was doing so late. But Mr. Huang asked this girl Lola if he could ask her something, and she said anything. Mr. Huang asked what the consequences would be if he killed someone. He checked with Lola's girlfriend to see if he was serious or if he was joking, given that Korea had not yet signed the Indian Hunters Crime Pact. Since you are a hunter from America, you will be tried in America, and the case will probably be easily hushed up. To this answer Mr. Huang was pleased. And when he turned around, he was terribly angry. After all, some brats had killed his brother, and if he didn't crush them with his hands, he wouldn't be able to sleep in peace. It was S-rank hunter Huang Dongsu of the Cleaners Guild. He began to reflect that 7 of his brother's men were dead and 2 of some boys survived. And the survivors were D and E ranks, and his brother was not the kind of man who would risk his life for weaklings. Also, they were only porters, not fighters, and they must not have trapped and killed him. And that's why he told him he couldn't do anything without me. Mr. Huang began to tell the girl that he needed to visit Korea for a while, and she in turn should clear out for him. To which the girl replied that if he disappeared so suddenly, the guild would be paralyzed. I asked the girl when he would have some free time, and she said in about 2 weeks. However, Mr. Huang stated that 2 weeks is not enough time even for a decent funeral. He would have an opportunity for revenge, but the girl Lola asked, "Will it be alright?" He was more than sure of that. He hoped that the 2 scoundrels would still be alive in 2 weeks. And the 2 guys in question were Hunter D rank Jin Ho and Hunter E rank Sun Jin Woo. At the time, I was outside in the late afternoon, standing outside the building with my blade in hand and holding the dungeon key. I realized that when I fulfilled the conditions of the quest, a hidden quest opened up. This key allows me to enter the dungeon of the Demon Castle and can only be used in Songgu Tower. I certainly expected to get a better than usual reward, but I didn't think I would get an S-grade item. I realized that the hidden quest is only given out if you exceed the daily quests, and for me that's a good chance since I picked the shiny random box and couldn't take the cursed one. Anyway, I got the key to the dungeon and now I just have to enter it. When I went through the portal, I came out on the other side, where there was fire everywhere. I realized that if the class matched the difficulty of the dungeon, it was an S-rank dungeon, and the chance of my survival must be 0. And of course, there is no proof that my assumption is correct. But on the other hand, the dungeon I created earlier corresponded to a gate to a dungeon of rank E. So, what am I going to do if the key class matches the dungeon difficulty? I still have the return stone. If it gets too hot, I'll just use it and all I have to do is put my best foot forward. There's no future dungeon sweeping with Jin Ho's rank. So I just have to find out the limits of my strength. If I back down because I'm afraid, I'll never get stronger. At that moment, a monster approached me, and he was already beside me. It was a 3-headed strange dragon dog. His name was the Guardian of the Gates of Hellserber. I knew, looking at him, that I would become much stronger, for I could not die. Instead, I would raise my level even higher. I can't die in a place like this. Yes, and the key that allows you to enter the demonic castle is a Class S item. If the rarity of the key matches the difficulty of the dungeon, then the chances of my survival tend to 0. And the best choice would be to level up as high as I can, and return when I get stronger. Once I reach rank B, the difficulty of the dungeon begins to increase exponentially, which is fortunate. The higher the level of the dungeon, the lower the chance of that level gate, and the number of existing S-grade dungeon enemies. Even if S-ranked hunters assemble in teams, this does not guarantee that they will be able to clear this type of dungeon. Only such gates were found on Jeju Island, and after the gate was breached, the terrain there turned into a scorched wasteland, uninhabitable. The current hunter situation does not allow me to effectively defend all S-rank dungeons, and with my current level I had to refrain from visiting S-rank dungeons. The threat of so many S-rank monsters is incomparable, their incredible toughness and crushing power. I jumped from my seat and started fighting this monster, and then a thought occurred to me: would my attacks have any effect on a monster of this level? It made me simply curious. Suddenly I saw a notification from the system informing me that my Wolf Killer title and sprint skill had been activated. My movement speed had increased by 30%, but now I had to spend 1 mana unit per minute. I approached the monster and began to deal more and more damage to it. In response to my attack, the monster roared loudly. I continued to hit it, and at one point activated my ability, Bloodlust. But at that moment my effect was cancelled, because my opponent's resistance was too high. This monster began to go into a rage, as a result of which the whole atmosphere around us changed. And then I realized that it didn't work. It wasn't a bad opportunity to test my abilities, but we never used it, and the difference in power was too great. Even despite the effect of my... And then I realized that this was, without a doubt, a rank S dungeon. At this point Cerberus, the Guardian of Hell's Gate, began to use the Wrath skill, and it will be active for 3 minutes. At this point, Cerberus' characteristics will be doubled. Cerberus started to run straight at me, but I noticed that the system was indicating the difference in our strength. And when I was able to hit him in the head with my blade, I was notified that the system was telling me that Cerberus felt no pain and my attacks just couldn't reach his pain threshold. I thought I was going to get it right, but really I needed to think 10 more times before heading into this dungeon. Now, however, I can't just stop. I hesitated for a second, and one of Cerberus' heads came right at me. Before I could dodge it, it bit into my shoulder with its big fangs. It made me uncomfortable, and I felt a terrible pain. In an instant, it threw me to the ground. I lay there not knowing what would happen next. Would I survive? As I lay in the ground, rocks protruding from my sternum, I began to get continuous notifications that my health was rapidly dwindling. Eventually a notification appeared that my health had dropped below 30%, and the Fortitude ability was activated, which reduced the damage I was receiving by 50%. I realized that even in such a horrible situation, the system helps the player as much as possible to make sure he doesn't die. So it would be quite difficult for the perfect player to die. But I knew I could handle it, because it's different from a normal rebirth. If I became someone's plaything in the system, all I have to do is exceed the expectations of whoever is playing me. At one point there was a hack into the system, and I was awarded my first status recovery award. I successfully accepted it, and at the same moment a bright light illuminated us. I instantly grabbed Cerberus by the head with my hands and began to climb up. When I was on my feet, with a strong effort, I scrolled through the servers and tossed them aside. At the same moment, I jumped up with my blade in my hands and struck one of the heads, then immediately jumped over to the other and delivered a crushing blow. Cerberus fell to the ground. I hoped he wouldn't get up again after that. When I landed on the ground and saw the total chaos and destruction in front of me, I realized that I had managed to kill the Guardian of the Hellgate after all, and my level began to increase significantly. I stood beside Cerberus' body and thanked him, for thanks to him I realized my current level. If I opened that gate that had just appeared, I would simply die. I'll come back here when I'm much stronger and can go inside. In addition, as a reward, I'll be able to get an item, the Guardian's necklace, as well as the key to the castle gate and Cerberus's phone. But at this time late at night, in one of the buildings, 2 men met, and the guy in the stylish black suit began to say that he was the genius director of some business and some business he wanted to talk to me about. That older man started saying that he heard that everything that happened in the dungeon stays in the dungeon. But the other guy didn't understand what he was implying. Suddenly the old man threw a bag on the table and pointed it toward the man. He began to say that the bag contained 20 billion, and he thought the man understood what he was trying to say. He begged that hunter to take the case. This old man who held out the bag started shaking and begged the guy to kill those bastards. But in response, the old man heard the guy start saying that he would have to pay an extra 10 billion for all the other hunters. And if he can do that, we'll have a deal, because there's no problem for me to kill those insects he was talking about. But there will be other hunters with them. If you become a ranked hunter, you become a high-ranked hunter that the guild pays attention to. But you know why I wasn't tempted to join the Hunter Guild Oversight Division? The thing is, it's more interesting to me to kill people than monsters, said the guy in the black suit. A little later we see 2 guys practicing taekwondo. One of them is stepping on the other one, and the guy who has already taken off his sword and finished his training is watching. After they finished training, they took off their equipment, and one of the students told his master that he was in good shape, as always. But Mr. Sleepy turned around and asked him, "What are you talking about? After all, this old body will become useless if I stop training it." It was obvious that he had been restrained with me during training, and he was putting less energy into his thumb, taking care of it. But this guy wouldn't have done that if he still had 2 hands. But Mr. Sleep stopped that guy, because he's still talking about it, even months later. But suddenly Mr. Song got an important call. After all, hunters of no particular rank still get those annoying calls. So Mr. Song asked his partner to finish his training for the day. But the guy asked Mr. Song, is he really planning to postpone his retirement? But Mr. Song replied that even if he's alive for the long haul, whether or not he's retired, he wants to remain useful to this world. Mr. Song was surprised, for it amazed him that an S-rank hunter would learn the way of the sword from a soon-to-be novice like him. But that guy replied, all because even a high rank does not make up for a lack of skill. A little while later, Mr. Song was walking down the street, pondering that this time he would have to go into a dungeon of rank 2. And since his awakening had no effect on his power, he wondered why a swordsman like him had awakened as a hunter mage. After all, the sword skill he had been learning for the past decade could no longer be used in a dungeon, and there had to be a reason for that. But suddenly Mr. Song turned his attention to the guy standing beside him. When he apologized, I turned to him and saw that it was Mr. Song. He looked at me and was surprised, for he didn't recognize me at all, for there was no trace of the old me left. I had changed so much in just a few months. And he asked what had happened to me. And when he put his head down, he said he couldn't talk like that. Still, he wondered how I recovered my torn leg. But I started to explain that when I came to, it was already fine, and I'm not sure what really happened. Mr. Song didn't understand how that was possible, and it wouldn't have been good for a young man like you to be disabled. It was a great relief to him. Mr. Song began to tell me not to worry about it, because he was glad he could survive with my abilities. The word got back to him that I had survived, and I still couldn't believe it when I saw me with my own eyes. I started to ask him if he was still working under the guild's orders. He replied that yes, he did. Apparently, so are you. But when we turned around, we saw 3 silhouettes coming toward us. Mr. Song was surprised, for he had met some old acquaintances that day. Everyone who was there that day was back together again, and that healer girl named Juhi looked at me strangely, as if she had seen a ghost. But I noticed some guys beside her that I especially didn't want to see. It was Mr. Kim, and Mr. Song saw him and began to think that he had run away that day, leaving us behind. He must not have been happy to see us after he threatened me with his sword to use me as a victim. But even I left Jin Woo at the end, and at this point he has no right to judge them. He didn't think about it before, but now he sees that we all came back alive. Julie looked at me and started to say that I had changed so much, because she almost didn't recognize me. But I replied that I was a little late. But the fact that she was looking all over for me and didn't understand why now and why I had grown so much and my leg must be in bad shape. But when she saw my feet, she knew I was fine, and she didn't understand what was wrong. 12. But just as I started to answer, I heard words behind me that someone had started talking about a romantic atmosphere. And when we turned around, we saw the prisoners getting out of the car. They started saying that someone was shooting drama here or the hunters had decided to have a date tonight. But the guy, the last one to get out of the car, ordered them to shut up. 13. After all, this is no picnic, and we need to be more serious. But when one of the inmates walked by Jijo, he told her to take care of them today. We didn't understand what it was all about, but the manager came up to us and apologized for being late. She wanted to take care of the formalities first, but we were wondering what was going on here and why the prisoners were here. The girl began to answer that these people were in rehab, so they should join the hunters in this raid. But Mr. Sleepy was angry, because how can they go through rehab and also suggest that we go on a raid with criminals? But the girl replied that even though they are criminals and have been hunters in the past, it is not uncommon for hunters to commit crimes and serve time in dungeons to reduce their sentence. The girl started apologizing and told us to take note, because the number of hunters in the area has greatly diminished, so they have to resort to such measures. Also, the Department of Surveillance Hunter, TASIC, joined the raid. So we don't have to worry about that, because it takes about 10 hunters to handle the average rank hunter. At this point I knew something was wrong here, so I asked Mrs. Dewey, please don't enter this raid. She responded by asking, will I go? I replied, yes, and at that point she said she was going too, and we were all ready to go out on this raid. After a while, we began to approach the portal. Mr. Son was kind of uncomfortable, since we were probably all going together after all. Perhaps this is fate. We began to walk forward. After all, we were ready for all this. Mr. Son walked ahead as the leader of this group, just as he did when we went into that double dungeon. When they started to take the handcuffs off these criminals, they began to say, "Well, that's much better." One of the criminals turned around and asked who gave him permission to treat them as slaves. But in response he heard the jailer say, "Shut your mouth." Mr. Song asked me if I minded if he became the leader today. I said yes, but in response I saw him thank me for giving him another chance. He bowed his head and began to say that if it hadn't been his fault, 11 people would have died, and because of me 6 survived. He was responsible for failing to protect them, and he thanked me on behalf of all the hunters. But I asked him to raise his head, because everyone was already paying attention. When Mr. Song looked up, he asked Mr. Kim if he would mind if he led today's raid. But Mr. Kim turned around and started into the dungeon, telling him to do what he wanted. After a while, when we were already inside, the goblins started attacking us. There were a lot of them, but the jailers deftly handled them. One of them beat a goblin with a whip, while a second killed and cut them in half with a large stick. The third, using his bare hands, beat all the goblins that were near him. He destroyed one of the goblins with one punch, but we looked at them and didn't understand which one was the monster and which one was human. But Mr. Song was looking so intently at the jailers that he didn't notice that there was a goblin behind him. He managed to react, however, and turned around and hit him with his fire magic. He deftly used his skills, and any goblins that approached him were instantly destroyed by the infernal flames. Mr. Kim looked at Song and saw that this man had incredible strength. However, Mr. Song turned around and asked Mr. Kim, "Is it normal for a swordsman to have such a weak swing?" Our leader started talking to get us to be more positive. After all the survivors of that incident are back together, and when he turned his attention to me, he said that he thought I had gotten stronger, and asked where I had found such a good dagger. After all, it is strange to see a normally unarmed Song using a dagger, and Jihu also turned her attention to me and said that she had never had to heal me until now, and asked if I was sure that I had not practiced martial arts lately. But I replied that I was just doing my exercises every day. Mr. Song began to reflect on what he had said, and it was no joke. After all, I did look very different from the Jin Woo he used to know. He looked at me and saw that not only my appearance but also my aura had changed. After all, I had always thought I was hopeless, but now I was very much even in myself, and I was finally a man. Juhi, on the other hand, seems frightened. She is still afraid of goblins, her trauma must be deep, and unfortunately, at this rate she will have to quit. But at this time we saw that there were 3 tunnels in front of us, and the overseer began to tell us that the dungeon was relatively easy and suggested that we split up. However, the danger would increase and the passage time would be greatly reduced. The warden said that he would watch the prisoners and go the right way. If we happen to find the boss room, we can call them, but I saw with my own eyes the aura coming from the left tunnel and asked the leader to take the left path. At that moment, however, I saw the face of that overseer, and something about him didn't please me. When we finally split up, I realized that the boss is at the end of this path, and with goblins I get almost no experience. I need to kill the boss, too, to get anything at all. What's more, the good thing about this guy is that he went along with the prisoners, and I won't see him again. 11. As our paths diverged, the warden went into one of the corridors with the outlaw. He asked the outlaws if they could take care of the goblins, to which they replied that the goblins were weak and simple, and had no chance against them. In fact, however, goblins are usually weaker than adults, and their size and intelligence are comparable to children. Nevertheless, they are pesky creatures who can swarm near a target and attack with support. Of course, even if you give guns to human children, they will be just as pesky, because a child with a gun can kill someone. And frankly, there are plenty of child soldiers who are armed and attacking people on the other side of the earth. There is no difference between humans and monsters here, both are insects, was what the warden told the criminals. He asked them if they could convince the children. But they said, "What kind of a stupid question is that?" But the jailer kept saying that they would need hundreds of children in that dungeon. From that moment on, they did not understand what he was talking about or why there should be children in the dungeon. The warden began to say that they did. The bottom line is that they are willing to kill anybody to survive. And so he would say to the Hunters Guild, "Guys, we ran into hundreds of goblins here. But in the meantime, the other group, where Mr. Kim and the other guy were dealing with all the goblins and realized that if they were so easy, they could handle them. It would have been nice if the raid had ended without incident. Mr. Kim suspected something would happen. After all, if I'm weaker than the hunter, then the dungeon is weak, too. He remembered that it wasn't, and then they said, in that double dungeon. But it wasn't like that at all, and Mr. Kim decided that after that he would also bow to Mr. Jin Woo to apologize. Mr. Kim asked the guy if he felt guilty, too. After all, they both did. Then they ran away, because they are what they are called hunters, and they can't act like they normally do. But after they left allies in trouble, if we're going to continue to be hunters, we have to get used to something like a little bowing. Mr. Kim doesn't know if he can get forgiveness, though. Even if he won't forgive us, I have to apologize, he said. But that guy started saying we don't have time now and we have to keep going. And since there are two of us, we have to be careful. And it looked like those who went the other directions weren't done yet. But suddenly Mr. Kim came around the corner, and what he saw horrified him. The warden began to say to the prisoner, "Our lovelies, we've had enough of you ourselves, and our job is to kill you as painfully as possible." I guess I was done with them too quickly, but it was fun to watch you call for help. And your bodies are lying under my feet, but there's nothing I can do about that anymore, because I was told to kill you fast. And at that moment Mr. Kim and his partner came out from around the corner, and he was horrified by what he saw. The warden had killed 2 prisoners, and he had the third by the throat and was about to deal with him in the same way himself. When the warden saw your hunters looking at him, he didn't understand where they were coming from. And that means that the way to the boss's room is on the left. Now you won't have to walk around aimlessly, and his schedule has changed a bit. At that moment I heard a scream coming from the other end of the hallway, and I immediately felt a thirst for blood. I asked Mr. Song to hurry back, and we started running back. When we ran into the next corridor at the end of the tunnel, I saw the warden, lurking in an ambush, tried to kill Jin Woo, but I managed to react and stopped his blow. At this point it became clear to him that I was as fast as he was. I asked him why he was doing this and why he wanted to kill us. The warden was shocked that I was able to block his ambush. The warden bounced back at this point and didn't understand how I got such power. After all, I had actually stopped his attack, and the warden realized that I had a heightened sense. The overlord began to say that even if it hadn't been in my plans to fight everyone else, it seemed that the healer would still have been a nuisance. So I tried to eliminate her first. But it looks like I'm going to have to change my plan. I'm going to kill you all right here. When Mr. Song started yelling at him to stop and asked why the guild member was doing that, I turned around. But what I saw behind me made me not believe my eyes. He who is only 1 in 1,000 awakened, and only 1 in 5,000 awakened, is a Diranga or higher. The responsibility for many lives rests on our shoulders, 1 in 5,000. Although I am a hunter, I am also a husband and the father of my children. So I cannot die today, and I cannot die tomorrow. Mr. Kim, covered in blood because he was cut by that warden, sat up, but I looked at him and could not imagine such an outcome. It's a raid. I saw him sitting on the ground bleeding. I asked Mrs. Jui to hurry up and fix him quickly. She ran up to him and started to heal him, but I heard back from her that we couldn't save him, because it was too late. She needs to stop wasting her strength, for he has already lost too much blood. But I started yelling at him that he had to live, because he said he had to live for his family. He must live, no matter what, so I could hate him. But in response I heard him tell me that he was sorry, and he didn't want to apologize. That's how he wanted to apologize in his head. But if he put his head down now, he would just die. After all, Mr. Kim did let out his last breath and put his head down for good. The last thing I heard from him was him telling me that he was really sorry it had happened that way. And after that I never heard from him again, for he was sitting there covered in blood, nailed to the wall, exhausted and wounded. I started to ask the other warden, why did he do that to Mr. Kim? But the answer I heard was that the warden said he didn't know, because it could have been monsters. And then one day the gates opened and the monsters burst out. It was like a natural disaster. Now he came up with a great story. It was originally supposed to be the story of a massacre by goblins, but it seems like he has to change it a little bit. Got out and tried to escape, and after they killed all of you, they tried to attack me while I was fighting the boss. But their strength was clearly not enough to kill a hunter of rank, and in the end the only survivor of this raid was me. The warden asked us if we thought the people outside would believe such a story. But I thought he was just a piece of shit, at which point Mr. Song told me to stop, because he wasn't the kind of man I could handle. I should leave it to him. Mr. Song understood that he was in rank, and a hunter like me from rank wouldn't be able to hurt him. Besides, he's an assassin class hunter, and I would lose him in speed, but Mr. Song picked up the sword that lay near his feet, and realized that perhaps the Overlord had a weak defense, and who knows what would happen if I managed to get his spells. After all, it had been a long time since I'd fought against a human. At this point Mr. Song asked Miss Jui if she could cast a physical strength enhancing spell on him. And she agreed. At the same moment, she applied her skill to Mr. Song so that he could not return. When the BAF went into effect, Mr. Song was already ready to act. The warden looked at all this and asked what he was going to do. After all, he is an ordinary mage, and the buff that increases physical strength is really quite useless to mages. But now, Mr. Sun was willing to do all this for the sake of revenge and to protect all those who were near him. He won't do it the same way he did last time, and he won't just run away from this dungeon, because he is a swordsman, not an ordinary mage. And since I am a mage, I need to be wary of the differences in strength, stamina, and dexterity between us. Even if I'm protected by Miss Jui, it's like putting a car engine on a bicycle and pedaling as hard as I can. It's like a steep descent. If I can't control my speed and I drift, I'll probably die. While I was thinking about my plans, the warden had already attacked me and was ready to destroy me at that second. The Overlord didn't consider it normal for a mage to be defenseless against an assassin, and it was a good idea to bring a weapon with him. But he's only a mage, and his physical strength didn't even reach D rank. What difference would the fact that he brought a weapon make? But after these words from the warden, Mr. Song engaged him, and I saw how Mr. Song was instantly able to hit him as if to cut him in half. Mr. Song had pretty good moves, and he was also strong thanks to the healer buff. Besides, Mr. Song had practiced a lot of sword fighting, but he still lacked the speed to catch up with that guy. I noticed how Song was able to catch up to the Overlord for a second, but it was still an obvious difference in class. They continued to fight, but Mr. Song wasn't getting anywhere, because his sword wasn't keeping up with that guy's speed. The Overlord began to smile suspiciously, because he noticed that his opponent's attacks were so fast and accurate, and that's pretty cool. It was a good idea to give up the magic and take up arms. Still, Mr. Song miscalculated a bit, and the warden was able to wound him. After that, the warder began to say that if he thought a little, he would understand why there were no mage swordsmen among the massive hunters. But suddenly he saw the healer begin to heal him, and the wound he had inflicted disappeared instantly. The healer became a real headache for the Overlord, and the Overlord decided that he could not let this battle drag on. The warden decided to finish off the healer at the first opportunity, for to him he was now the source of many problems. But at that very moment, Mr. Song began to act, for it was not a good idea to put the swordsman's back to him in combat. A second more and Mr. Song would have finished off the Overlord, but he managed to turn around and parry his blow. Mr. Song was no ordinary old man, and the jailer understood that already. After all, you can't tell about Mr. Song, but he has an apprentice who is of rank S. If his body isn't strong enough, his skills make up for it. But the warden didn't think so, and unfortunately, there are always limits to a given strength.